As this is Black History Month, my message today is a little bit less of a sermon and more of a teaching. We're going to look back at some of the unknown African-American missionary heroes during the time frame that our country was founded. So we're talking about the late 1700s, early 1800s is what we're going to be focusing on today. We're going to talk about why this is important and then apply some lessons to our own lives towards the end. But first, I want to thank Skylar for his help in researching some of this, and I want to thank Paige for the incredible PowerPoint presentation that she made here over the last couple days. So let me set the stage for you and give you a background before we get into some of these unknown African-American missionary heroes. Around this time, there was what's called the Moravian movement. If you've heard of the Moravians at all, Moravia was a country, what is now, I believe, Czechoslovakia, but it was its own territory. And the Moravians had a 100-year prayer meeting, nonstop, 24 hours, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, nonstop prayer meeting for 100 years. And they were kind of in the middle of this in the late 1700s. There were also some from England who were sending missionaries here back to what we call New England now. But there was not a strong environment for Christians sending missionaries to certainly unreached parts of the world. As an example, at a meeting of Baptist leaders in the late 1700s, a newly ordained minister named William Carey, he stood to argue for the value of overseas missions. And he was abruptly interrupted by an older minister who said, "Young man, sit down. When God desires to convert the heathen, he'll do it without the likes of you or me." Okay. If you were a young minister, how would you think? So this was kind of the environment of Christian missions. This was also the era of the publication of what became known as the Slave Bible. Now, the Slave Bible is a real book. It's on display at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. It was originally published in London in 1807 on behalf of the Society for the Conversion of Negro Slaves. That's what this society was called. It was an organization dedicated to improving the lives of enslaved Africans working in Britain's Caribbean colonies, so Jamaica, Bermuda, that area. So they used the Slave Bible to teach slaves English and also in hopes to convert them to Christianity. But unlike many other regular Bibles, the Slave Bible contained only select parts of the biblical text. Its publishers deliberately left out portions of the Bible, such as the book of Exodus, that could inspire hope for liberation. Instead, the publishers emphasized portions of the Bible that justified the system of slavery that was so vital at the time to the British Empire. So most of the Old Testament is gone from this book, and only about half of the New Testament remained. The reason? So that enslaved Africans in the Caribbean islands couldn't read or be read anything that might incite them to rebel. The Slave Bible doesn't include Moses leading the Israelites to freedom, but it does include Joseph's enslavement in Egypt. It also includes Ephesians 6:5, slaves, be obedient to your masters. So we need to study history for lots of reasons. One being, let's make sure nothing like this ever happens again. The environment of Christian missions at the time was not good. But that all started to change, due in part to some unknown African-American missionaries that were sent from the U.S. In the late 1760s, there were two men, Bristol Yama and John Quimono. They were from Guinea, Africa. And John's father was very wealthy, and he decided to send Bristol and John to Newport, Rhode Island, to study and to get an education among the English. And the plan was then for them to return home. What happened is the captain that was transporting them to Newport, Rhode Island, decided to sell them into slavery. Thankfully, they were able to get their freedom, to regain their freedom at a later date. And the two converted to Christianity soon after they arrived in Newport, Rhode Island. And in 1770, a white pastor named Samuel Hopkins, he devised a plan to send Bristol and John back to Guinea as missionaries. And so this is a copy of the letter that Pastor Samuel Hopkins wrote. If you can read it, it says, "To the public" at the top. I'm sure you can't read the fine print, but here's a portion of it. Pastor Samuel Hopkins writes about these two, John and Bristol. "They're not only willing, but very desirous to quit all worldly prospects and risk their lives in attempting to open a door for the propagation of Christianity among the poor, ignorant, perishing, heathen brethren." Now, why would it be risking their lives? Well, if you were sold into slavery on your way, how excited would you be to get back on a boat to head back to Africa? Probably not very excited. But they knew one thing, that Jesus is worthy, and that their brethren in Guinea were perishing and going to hell without knowing him. So from 1760 to about 1776, these two were trained in missions. They were educated. Part of the time they studied at what is now Princeton University, and actually most likely were the first black college students to attend college here in America. They also spent time trying to raise funds. So several years they're trying to raise funds, and part of that letter here that we see is the pastor appealing for funds. And so another black Christian in Newport named Salmar Nuba, he was a member of the Second Congregational Church in Newport, Rhode Island. He got wind of this plan, and he volunteered to go with Bristol and John back to Guinea as a missionary. And so here's what is written of Salmar. "He is promising as a person of a good genius and giving evidence of real piety. He is about 20 years old and has lately had his freedom given to him. He's greatly desirous and engaged in some way to promote the spread of the gospel among the Africans." Isn't this remarkable? Although Pastor Hopkins, and another pastor in Newport, Rhode Island, they actually hope to send 30 to 40 missionaries back to Africa behind Bristol and Salmar and John. But their plan never developed due to the British occupation of Newport in 1776. So why is this important? And Dave, when are you going to get to the Bible? We're going to get there. Trust me. This is missions class. But why is this significant? Because these are people, most likely, that you have never heard about. In the early, even before the founding of our nation, wanted to go to tell their unreached brethren about Jesus. This is the very first plan to send missionaries from what would later become the United States to another country. And you know what? Sometimes history gets things wrong. Let me tell you about another hero named George Lyle. Born a slave in Virginia, Lyle was taken to Georgia, where he was converted in 1773 in the church of his master, Henry Sharp. He soon became concerned about the spiritual condition of his fellow slaves, and he began preaching to them. In 1775, he was ordained as a missionary to work among the black population in the Savannah, Georgia area. And like many other slaves, he sided with the British during the Revolutionary War, as did his master, Henry Sharp, and he set Lyle free in 1778. In order to be evacuated with the other royalists and British troops, Lyle obtained a loan, accepted the status of an indentured servant to pay the passage for himself and his wife and his 4 children on a ship bound for Jamaica. Landing there in January 1783, this is important for you to remember. George Lyle landed in Jamaica January 1783. He soon repaid the debt and secured permission to preach to the slaves on the island. He then proceeded to evangelize and plant churches. So I know some of you are on your phones already, which you're not supposed to be in chapel because you're supposed to be listening, right? But I want everybody to get out your phones, and I want you to Google something, okay? And this is like audience participation a little bit. So Google this phrase: First American Missionary. First American Missionary. And then tell me what comes up. What are some of the responses there? Adoniram Judson. Yeah, that's probably number 1. You see George Lyle in there? He might be the second, or maybe he's not there at all. What are the third, the fourth entries, the results that you see? Who are they? Adoniram Judson, right? When did Adoniram Judson, click on one of those, when did he go to Burma? What year? 1788? He was born in 1788. When did he go to Burma? 1812. Adoniram Judson went to Burma as the first American missionary in what year? 1812. When did George Lyle land in Jamaica? Who was the first American missionary? George Lyle. So why does the internet say that it was Adoniram Judson? I don't know. We'd better fix it. Not to discount anything that Adoniram did or stood for. But Adoniram Judson left in 1812. George Lyle was the first American missionary. He was planting churches in Jamaica nearly 30 years prior to Judson's departure for Burma. And by 1814, Lyle's ministry in Jamaica produced some 8,000 Christians on the island. Unfortunately, sometimes the internet's wrong. You did know you can't believe everything you read on the internet, right? Wikipedia doesn't always have their facts straight, and obviously in this search that we just conducted here, this is why we need to think critically and not just take in and believe everything. That doesn't mean you have to have a critical spirit. There's a big difference. You understand the difference between having a critical spirit and thinking critically? I was trying to explain this to two of my boys this morning. I'm not sure that they got it or not. Thinking critically. It wasn't Luke. It was my... Luke gets it, for sure. It's my younger boys. Okay, so obviously history's not always correct. Let me tell you about another African-American missionary named David George. He pastored the first all-black Baptist church in America. He planted the first black Baptist church in Canada and the first Baptist church on the continent of Africa. David George was his name. He was born a second-generation slave in Virginia around 1743. Anybody remember where George Lyle was born? Virginia. David George was born in Virginia, 1743, but about the age of 19, he fled south to Georgia after watching his mother being whipped and left to die. For the next 10 years, David George lived a difficult life on the run in the wilderness of Georgia. He was captured, he was traded several times until finally settling on a plantation in Silver Bluff, South Carolina. And as only God would ordain, this was about the time that George Lyle begun a preaching tour to slaves in the area. And wouldn't you know, David George and George Lyle were childhood friends. And here comes George Lyle on a preaching tour, preaches, David George hears it, accepts the Lord, and decides that God is calling him into ministry. And that's why here you see the very first all-black Baptist church in America planted by none other than David George. In 1783, George and he had a team of others. They formed the first Baptist church in what is now Canada. He and his family went to Sierra Leone, West Africa, in 1792, where he spent nearly 20 years evangelizing and church planting. Amazing. One more. We can't talk about African missionary heroes without talking about the first single woman missionary in the modern mission era. Her name was Betsy Stockton. And we tried to find a happier picture of Betsy, but we couldn't find one. So even though she looks a little crabby here, she wasn't, all right? She was born in Princeton, New Jersey, 1798, and at an early age, she was given to the wife of Reverend Ashbel Green as a domestic slave. Now, Reverend Green was the president of the College of New Jersey, which later became Princeton University. Betsy was given permission to attend evening classes at the college. And in the winter of 1815, a huge revival hit Princeton University. And Betsy became a Christian at that time. And she believed with all her heart that it's the sacred duty of Christians to offer themselves in humble obedience to God's call to carry out his plan of salvation through Jesus Christ for the world. And so she felt God calling and convicting her to take the gospel to those who have never heard. Remember, this was not the culture. Like we had Marv Newell last semester for, a third of us. You remember that? A third of the world is unreached. That's kind of our Christian missions culture now. Let's minister to the unreached. There was nothing like this when Betsy heard this call. So this growing conviction shaped the rest of her life. And she ended up going to Hawaii, which of course was not a part of the United States at this time. And as soon as she arrived, she set out to learn Hawaiian. She started teaching in a school. Her passion and work made a significant contribution to the missionary team and provided a platform for evangelism and discipleship. Amazing. So let's just review a little bit of this. If we go to the next slide, the early chronology of black missionary sending from the U.S. looks like this. 1970, we talked about Pastor Samuel Hopkins of Newport, Rhode Island, devising this plan to send missionaries to Africa. But it didn't ever come to fruition. 1783, George Lyle landed, the first American missionary to go overseas anywhere, landed in Kingston, Jamaica. And by the way, he's buried in Kingston somewhere in an unmarked grave, I'm told. 1783, David George and his team, Hector Peters, Sampson Calvert, they went to Nova Scotia and then on to Sierra Leone. In 1783, again, we don't have time to talk about Moses Baker and George Gibbons, some great African-American missionary heroes that were sent to the West Indies. And in 1790, Prince Williams sailed from the U.S. to the Bahamas. So again, 7 black missionaries went overseas to share the gospel with those who have never heard well before Adoniram Judson left the U.S. So we need to fix that part about our history, because we need to tell the truth about what happened. And the stories of Betsy and many others, like George Lyle and David George and others like them, reminded me of another story from the scriptures. If you turn with me to Genesis 29, we're going to start in verse 16 and read just a few passages. You're probably familiar with the story, but instead of summarizing it, I wanted to read it. Genesis 29:16. Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel was lovely in form and beautiful. Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel." Laban said, "It's better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me." So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Almost Valentine's Day. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, my time is completed, and I want to lie with her." So Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a great feast. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and gave her to Jacob, and Jacob lay with her. And Laban gave his servant girl Zilpah to his daughter as her maidservant. When morning came, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" And Laban replied, "It's not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week, then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work." And Jacob did so. He finished the week. And then Laban gave him Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his servant girl Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her maidservant. Jacob lay with Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. And he worked for Laban another 7 years. When you think of the great heroes of the Bible, Leah doesn't usually come to mind, right? I mean, if you were going to think of the heroes of the Bible, you might give Jesus as the answer, of course, or maybe Gideon, mighty warrior, or Noah, or, you usually don't think of Leah. Leah was unloved and seemingly, please catch my terminology, seemingly insignificant to this story. But I want to thank the late Dr. George Wood for some of his thoughts on this story about Leah as we close today. Similar to these African-American missionaries that we've talked about, we're tempted to say about Leah, what a tragic and difficult life. So many people in her life were unfair to her, mistreated her. Her father forced her into marriage. Her sister, if you read on, totally resented her. Her husband didn't love her until later in life. Yet Leah's story teaches us an important truth, that your legacy will far outlast you, will far outlast your many decades here on earth. You see, the priestly line comes through Leah's third son, Levi. Have you ever heard of the Levites in the Bible? That was Leah's son, Levi. And in that line comes Moses, Aaron, Miriam. So without Leah, there's no Levi, there's no Moses, who wrote the Pentateuch. There's no first 5 books of the Bible without Leah. There's no 10 Commandments. There's no Exodus from Egypt. It was Leah's 4th son, Judah, who became the ancestor of King David and King Solomon. So without Leah, we have no Judah. Without Judah, no Boaz, no David, no Solomon. Without David or Solomon, we don't have most of the Psalms. We don't have the Proverbs. We don't have Song of Songs. And we don't have Ecclesiastes. If it weren't for Leah, unloved and unwanted most of her life. You know who else belongs to the line of Judah? Mary and Joseph. Judah was the 4th son of Leah, and so Elizabeth and Zechariah come from Levi's line. So basically, without Leah, there's no Judah. Without Judah, there's no David. Without David, there's no Jesus. Without Jesus, we have no salvation. Could God have used someone else? Yes, of course. But please don't overlook the significance and the lesson here of Leah's story. Like Leah. There are those in history who have made an incredible impact, even though their lives were difficult and seemingly insignificant. So you yourself may feel unloved. You yourself might be mistreated by some. You may feel like you're insignificant. Well, I'm here to tell you the truth, that you're not. Not only does God love you and have an incredible legacy in store for you and your life, but we love you. You have a significant role to play in the kingdom of God. God has put you here on purpose, in this very room, at this very hour. He is sovereign over your life. So when people mistreat you and hurt you, think about Leah and the impact that she made. And don't give up. The second thing that I think we can learn here is that your ministry and your legacy will far outlive you. And how you decide to live today, should the Lord tarry, will impact generations. Generations. And I want to invite the worship team back up because I want to sing Graves into Gardens again. Luke didn't know what I was preaching on. He chose the songs, and this is such an appropriate. I want the whole team to come back up if possible. So such an appropriate song here because look at what God has done in Leah's life. Look at what God did through some of these missionary heroes, most of whom you have never, ever heard before. Seemingly insignificant, definitely mistreated. But that's not the end of their story. And you know what? One more thing. That's not the end of Leah's story either. In Revelation 21, we learn that the names of the 12 tribes of Israel are given to the 12 gates of the New Jerusalem. It is through these gates that we enter heaven. And do you know whose kids are on the top of half of those gates that you or I may someday enter through? One of the great heroes of the Bible, Leah. So we may enter through the gate of Judah. We may enter through the gate of Levi or Zebulun or some of our other kids. God can take your graves and turn them into gardens. If he can do that with an unloved, unwanted Leah, what can he do with you? 10 years from now? Maybe 20. If he can take these unknown and unsung African-American missionary heroes that even the internet doesn't know about, and he can use them to transform continents. You may be unloved, you may be mistreated, you may feel insignificant, but you're not. What can God do through you 30 years from now? What's your legacy going to be? And so as we sing this song and close out service, I want you to ponder that about how he can take your graves and turn them into gardens.